welcome to Jackie's Literary Corner. I am Jackie, and it's time for a 7 on Sunday topic. So this week's topic, September 3rd, the first topic of the month, is your top 7 most intimidating books on your TBR. Okay, so let me put these down. I was trying to pose for a thumbnail. Okay. So there's a lot of these books. Okay, so I tried to make sure I didn't just do classics because there are a lot of classics that are still very intimidating to me that I want to read. But there are quite a few classics on here too. So the first one, the number one, is actually a whole series, and I'm going to hold up the book that I need to read next, because I read the first book like last year, I think, or 2 years ago, and at the time I was thinking, no, I wasn't sure if I wanted to read this, continue, but then watching some of my more newer favorite booktubers talking about the series and how much they loved it, it kind of re-inspired me. And that is Marillion, Book of the Fallen. This is book 2, Dead House Gates. And it's not like it's hard to read. It's just there's a lot going on in the story, and you're with different characters in each book, and then they eventually come together. I'm always hearing about, all the things I hear about the series kind of make me nervous about reading, like it's going to go over my head, or I'm going to get too confused. Because, for the longest time, I was kind of on the YA train, and those plots are still complex, and it can be really epic, but they're a little more simple compared to adult fantasy. Not that adult fantasy is that hard to understand, but it has some more complex concepts, I think. So every time I hear people talk about this book, especially like if they're trying to get a new person to read the series and is trying to be like, talking to them like, if you want to try this out. And they always say, and a lot of them always say, you can't, if you're gonna choose to start reading this, then maybe you should prioritize this and only read this, or not necessarily only read this book during the month, but just focus on this series. And I'm someone who reads multiple books at once. And even then, I had trouble reviewing Gardens of the Moon, which is the first book. I feel like when I talked about it, probably in a wrap-up, I don't know if I did a separate review or not. I feel like I didn't do a very good job talking about it, because, like, even though I love fantasy and that's my number one genre, sometimes I seem to have trouble writing, talking about fantasy and reviewing it, especially if it's a longer book. In the plots, there's a lot going on, like it's more of an epic story, like, Way of Kings I struggled, or even Ruin of Kings, I still kind of struggled giving a review of it. I mean, I knew I loved it, but explaining what was going on, the plot and everything, and it's partly to do with the fact that I will put these books down because they're so long, and they're a little slower than some of the YA fantasy I've read, and I end up getting sidetracked by other stuff, so I end up not remembering a lot of stuff. I mean, in fact, with Way of Kings, I end up watching Jay's summary of what happens in Way of Kings, Jay from Captured in Words, which really helped, although it did spoil for me the rest of the book, but it had been a long time since I read it. But anyway, I've heard a lot of things that make me nervous to read this, but I've also heard a lot of things that make me excited to read it. So yes, this whole series is very intimidating, and it has a lot of books just like Wheel of Time. So that's Dead House Gates by Steven Erikson, although he has a co-author who writes some of the other books in the world of Marillion, but I don't remember that author's name. Okay, now we're going to talk about classic number 2. Book number 2 is Les Miserables, which I always try to say it with the French accent, but I probably don't do a very good job with the pronunciation. But So, you guys, I'm sure you've heard. I have talked about the story of how I read the abridged version of this, not realizing it was an abridged, and I didn't realize until a couple years ago it was the abridged version. And at the time, I didn't love it. I was kind of bored with it, but for some reason, but I still love the musical and that the story the musical presents and everything. And and then years later, after having listened to the soundtrack of the musical several times and memorizing the songs, and then loving the movie that came out a few years ago, because I know a lot of people don't like. I think some people have critiques of the movie, like the singing and stuff like that. But then again, I also am also enjoy like Gerard Butler and Emma Watson singing in Phantom of the Opera and Beauty and the Beast. So apparently, I'm not the best judge of that kind of that of that kind of thing. But anyway, so I decided, because I love the musical, maybe now I would start reading the book, try the book again, and at the time, that's when I realized, oh wait, this book is a lot longer than the one I read, and then I realized that must mean it was the abridged version. Um, so I bought this, and I actually found myself enjoying it when I started reading it. I think it was 2020. I brought it with me when we took a beach vacation, because COVID had kind of kept us in our houses for a while, so we couldn't really go anywhere, or just could only go to work, basically. And and we finally took this vacation with the family, because COVID had calmed down a little bit at that time. And I enjoyed what I had read so far of this. But it's still very intimidating, because this isn't 1,000-page mark. And and I've always heard like there's some boring parts. I feel like with a lot of classics or a lot of bigger books, there's always going to be that boring part, the part that people say is not as, or I should say, older books specifically, whether they're classics or modern or a more recent but older, as in like the 90s or 80s. Because I've heard, there's a part in the Wheel of Time series that is said, oh, it's boring, it's a slog. And in this one, he talks a lot about the sewer system in France. So that's another thing that makes me a little apprehensive. And I mean, it's the same with Wheel of Time too. I get apprehensive when I'm anticipating the whole slog part books. But yeah, it's just, even though I did enjoy what I read so far of this, I still am worried there might be moments when I'll get bored, and it's so long. It's 1,000 pages. I mean, even though there's a lot of books I've read that are in the 1,000-page mark or close to it, and I still have finished those books, some of them I've started to reread already, and I have put them down again, because I still can't break the habit of being like, oh, there's all these other books I want to read too that won't take me as long as this. But yeah, it's really more about the length, and then knowing that there's going to be a part where he talks about the sewer system. And then there might be other boring parts. So yeah, Les Miserables is a bit intimidating. Okay, that's number 2. Number 3. Okay, so this one, I don't know, people might probably laugh at the fact that I find this intimidating. And it's not that hard to read. I mean, but there's aspects of it that might be more challenging. And that is the Children of Time series. And obviously I did start it. And it's, like I said, it's not that hard to read. But when it comes to science fiction, I'm worried that the whole science part is going to go over my head. Or, I'm going to eventually get bored with it. And so maybe intimidation maybe this is not the best. But yeah, the science intimidates me, because it might be so technical and dense, and just, even though it's not a hard read, it's a very simple read. there's going to be a lot of science discussion, like, and genetics discussions probably. That I feel like, because when I started reading, there were times when I was a little confused about what was going on, or at least what they were talking about was a little bewildering. And so I feel, and it makes me feel kind of dumb because I'm not a science person, but I do want to read science fiction. Which I think is why sometimes the science fiction that's more like time travel stories, but going into the past, traveling into the past type of sci-fi, or the sci-fi that has a sci-fi type setting, but it has more of a fantasy feel to it, like Star Wars or the Lunar Chronicles. Those I can really get into, and I know exactly what's going on. I understand it because there's not all the science talk. There's not all this, science discussion and all these terms and stuff, and explaining the science, behind it. And the same thing with like Dune. There's still some science element to it. It's still science fiction, but there's less. But it feels a little bit like a fantasy. Which in the past I've said is kind of funny that I feel that way, because I also don't like it when people get science fiction, call something that's, in my mind, clearly a fantasy when they call it science fiction. There was a time when, if you watch the show Supernatural, one of the actors who played one of the brothers was interviewed on, I think at the time it was still Kelly and Ryan, and Kelly called it science fiction, or Ryan called it science fiction, and my mom watches a lot, and I just was looking, and no, you guys, it's not science fiction. Yes, there are some science fiction elements like traveling through time, but it's not science fiction. So yeah, that's a little bit of a pet peeve of mine. But at the same time, I do lean towards stories that feel like where people might get them mixed up and might consider a story more, fantasy, like Star Wars. For instance, people that are, that aren't hardcore fans that like it, but they're not obsessed to know every little detail, they might consider it, a fantasy, because the Jedi mind powers can seem fantastical to some people. But yeah, so that's really why this is intimidating to me. It's not that it's a hard book to read, it's just the science stuff. I'm worried that's going to bog me down and confuse me, because I'm not a science person. I just like the idea of science fiction. But I might not necessarily understand the real, if it's doing real science, genetics or physics or something. So really that's the only reason why I put this on this list of intimidating books, because I feel like the science is a little intimidating. Okay, so next one is another classic, and that is Don Quixote by Miguel Cervantes. People talk about this book all the time and say how funny it is. They talk about how there's it's written into two different parts, two different books, and how one, and I know Murphy Napier did a review where she felt like one book was sadder than the other, while the other one was more comical and fun. And it's the first novel. It was it's considered the very first prose written novel, and it's just the idea of that is there's a little bit of pressure, and the writing is very dense, or it looks very dense in my copy, and I get nervous, when some of the stuff I hear about these older books, even if in the end they turned out to not be that hard to read, I still get nervous before I read them, and I still feel intimidated by them. And this is one of those books that I feel like it's gonna be, I hope I can get into it. And it's definitely one of these books where I feel like I need to read it in a way where I'm not falling asleep, where I can completely concentrate and there's no distraction. So it's one of those books I probably can't bring with me on road trips to, either my grandma's or my sister's, because my mom listens to talk radio to keep her awake. And that will kind of be a bit of a distraction. And this is one of those ones that I did start reading. I'm on chapter 6, but it's still, so I've read a little bit, and it's actually, like I said, it's like, it's weird because they still feel intimidating even if I start them, and I think, well, it's actually not that bad. Like I haven't got far enough for me to not still feel a little intimidated by it. Put it that way. And I think this is kind of a bit of a satire, so I'm worried that some of the humor might go over my head a little bit at times, but maybe not. Maybe I'm just being, overly, being presumptuous or being, I use the word today. I'm trying to think of the word. Maybe it is presumptuous. I don't know, but yeah, it still kind of feels intimidating, even if I've already started reading it. And it is another one, and again, like, the bigger the book, the more intimidating it can be for me. Okay, next. Now this one isn't actually big. This one is actually kind of small. Okay, by the way, that was number 4. That was the 4th book. So this 5th book is actually physically smaller than the others, but it's intimidating for a different reason. Not necessarily about the length. In this case, it's another one where it's about the content that's intimidating. So as you can see, there's a pattern here that either books are intimidating because of the length, or because of the writing, or because of the content. That's with all these books. I don't know if it's the same way for everybody else. That's why books are intimidating. But for me, those are the 3 reasons a book intimidates me. In this case, it's the content, and then it's Marillion by Tolkien. So this is kind of a creation story. So this is like reading the Bible, and I've never read the Bible. I am familiar with the Bible stories, of course, because I am a Christian / Methodist. So I grew up with the Bible stories. And I grew up with, on my mom's side, my grandparents were Catholic, I believe. And so, my uncle is married to a woman that's Catholic as well. And then I have an aunt on my dad's side who's very religious and goes to church. Although she hasn't, I don't know if she's been in years, but I know she used to go to church all the time. And we went to the same church, both for when I was a kid, and then when we went to a different church as I got older, she started going to that one as well, and we would get together, at Borders when Borders were still around every Sunday. So, but yeah, so I would, but I never read the Bible, but I was like familiar with the content of the Bible, the stories and everything. And that is kind of what the Marillion is for Middle Earth. Kind of a Bible, where it's the history of how Middle Earth was created. And I've tried to read it, and even the chapters are not that long, and it's not hard to necessarily read. It's just, again, it's very dense. It's short, it's not that long, but it's still very dense. It's like, it's not like the original Lord of the Rings, which is three parts in one big book. But that one is the story. It's a story. This one is kind of a story. But like I said, it's like reading the Bible. If you read the Bible. Or if you're at least familiar. But it's talking about Lord of the Rings in Middle Earth. The Christian Middle Earth. And so there's a lot of information and a lot of explaining things. And again, this is another one of those books where I feel like I need complete focus when I'm reading it, so I can remember things and recall things. And there's another book on here that's it's fiction, but it's a fictionalized history book, and that is Fire and Blood by George R. R. Martin. Not of Fire and Blood, but Fire and Blood. That's what I think it's Ryan Cahill. He has a book called Fire and Blood that just came out, though. Or at least I think maybe not the second, or the one of those in-between books. I don't, he's actually someone I want to read. And when I'm going to get a Kindle for this trip, to London we're gonna take, and that might be one of the books I'll either get on Kindle Unlimited for those 3 months I have for free, or I might, buy it. And I think it's, but yeah, the titles are basically, I only bring it up because the titles are similar. But Fire and Blood by George R. R. Martin, it also kind of does a similar thing to Silmarillion, where it's kind of an origin story of, like, this one is like a Bible, and that one is like a history book, like a history textbook, because it's the history of the Targaryen family, and one of the I can't remember what they call their monks. The people that I think are like monk, I would describe them as like being like monks. I cannot remember what they call them. But he wrote a book about the Targaryen dynasty, and that one would probably also count as one that is intimidating because it's a big book, and there's a lot of information, and it's kind of, it's not a hard read, but it's like reading, like I said, it's like reading a history book. So yeah, this, because it's basically the creation of Middle Earth and its history and everything, there's a lot. I mean, like, I did start taking notes so I could actually, if I ever complete this book, I can give you guys a review and remember some of the information. Because, like I said, I put it down since, so that's why Silmarillion is intimidating, because it's a lot of information about the creation of Middle Earth. Okay, so next is that's book number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're on to number 6, so almost done. 2 more books to talk about. Next is another one. This is one of the ones where it's really more about the writing, which I guess the writing is also considered the content. But when I say content, I mean what the book is about is intimidating, while the writing is the writing, like how the book is written. And that is Ulysses by James Joyce. So now, which, by the way, some of these are books I bought at Books A Million for full price. So yes, some books, I'm not necessarily afraid to DNF books, but if I'm paying full price, I'm gonna continue trying to, to figure if I can get into it and maybe get past the intimidation factor if I play full price. Not always, because I did get rid of this one book, although it was a fantasy book, and it wasn't that it was hard or intimidating to read. It was like there were things about it I didn't like. But so Ulysses is one of those books I bought at Books A Million for full price. And so James Joyce gets really creative with his writing, and also does stream of consciousness. And stream of consciousness is something that I have struggled with. I want to get into it, but sometimes it can be very confusing. Because it's a lot of people, basically you're hearing the thoughts of someone, their ramblings, and being inside someone else's head and hearing their random thoughts can be very confusing. But yeah, this is basically a retelling of the Odyssey, but set in Ireland. And I do believe that Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, I mean, I think it's about James Joyce, but like, I think it kind of does a similar thing to what Dickens did with David Copperfield, where it was kind of biographical, an autobiography, but the names were different, and there were some differences between the author and the character they created, and I think that's what Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man does the same thing. And funnily enough, I noticed that the main character's name is Stephen Daldalius in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, while this one, that's the main character of this book, Stephen Daldalius, which I think Daedalus is the name of the son in the Odyssey, the name of Odysseus' son. Um, so it's like I said, it's kind of a retelling of the Odyssey, and I think Ulysses is another way to say Odysseus. Um, like maybe it's a Latin version of it. I don't know. I have to look it up. But anyway, so with the writing again, it's more about the writing and how he gets very creative with the writing style. And what's kind of annoying is when I read people's review, I just for some reason I was motivated. I'm gonna look at people's reviews of this book because I'm just curious. Because just because I look at reviews isn't always the same, you know. Because sometimes I'll look at reviews just to decide to give me justification to DNF a book, but that's not always the case. Sometimes I'm just curious about what other people say about the book. And what's really annoying and increases my intimidation is when people say stuff like, "Oh, Joyce is a genius," like, but he's also frustrating to read. Ulysses is a very frustrating book to read, but James Joyce is such a genius, and it's like, that makes it worse because it's like you don't want to sound stupid, and you don't want people to be like, and even if people are nice about it, and you tell them, "Oh, I can't read this book; it's just too much," and they're like, "Oh, that's okay," you still can't help but think they're being a little condescending, and they're just patting you on the head and be like, "It's okay, you're not smart enough for this, but nothing's wrong with that." Even if you're not as smart enough for it. Like, that's what it feels like. And that's more on me and my thinking. Because maybe that's not what they're thinking. When someone you're acquainted with, you tell them, "Oh, I tried to read Ulysses." And I mean someone who has read it. Because, of course, the people that haven't read it, they'll be impressed that you at least tried. Or either that or they'll think you're crazy. But yeah, so it's like even, I can't help but think that even if that's not true and they're not thinking that way, because very well they might not be thinking that way about you saying you can't read it. But it's just, I want to be like, and I don't want to come off as that person who's like, I'm only reading it just to say I read it at the same time. I want to read it and be able to appreciate and see its brilliance. But I'm worried I won't get it. Or I'll just be one of those people who just hates the book and is like, why did he have to do this? Or this is just confusing. This doesn't make any sense. Or something like that, There's, like, I feel like with Ulysses is one of those classics where you have two camps. The people who recognize its brilliance, its supposed brilliance, and just absolutely love it. Or there's the people that just absolutely hate it and don't get its brilliance and are like, this book is stupid. And James Joyce was just messing with us. And I don't know which camp I fall in. Because it's very intimidating. Either way. So yeah, I want to read it. And I have started it, obviously. Because a lot of these books I have started, it's just I put them down. Because I don't soft DNF. Like, to me, this is not a soft DNF. Because soft DNFs to me are when you're possibly thinking about DNFing and not reading it again. And just getting rid of it. Because I'm not one of those people who's going to keep a book just to show you guys that this is a book I DNF'd, but I want to use it for, ideas. Like, I'm not someone who does that. I mean, I wish I knew how to show you a digital image, but I don't know how to do that. So, anyway, I want, so yeah, I don't know, I guess that's it, I want to conquer this book, but I don't want to come off as I'm just reading just to conquer it. Like, I want to conquer it, I do, but I don't want people to think I'm only just doing it just to mark it off the list. I want to be able to appreciate it for its, for what he's doing and to understand it without seeming like I'm trying too hard. Then again, people might think I'm trying too hard anyway, and might think you should just give up. But I don't give up that easily. At least not a book that I am interested in reading, because I am interested. So the last book, this was a book that was introduced to me because I discovered a new channel last year, I believe. It was His name is Chris. His channel is called Leaf by Leaf. And he talks a lot about certain kinds of literary, like, books that are probably considered more literary works. And I mean, I think he probably talked about Ulysses. And again, I can easily be pulled in if someone talks about a book passionately enough. I mean, there are some books that I know I'm never going to be interested in, no matter how much you talk about it. But some of these books that are more, like, challenging, but have a supposed brilliance to them, sometimes if you talk enough about it and really dive deep into it, really explain it to me, when you talk about in your video, then, I mean, not explain it directly to me, but obviously, like, talk about in your video with enthusiasm and passion, then that could lure me in and lure me into spending the money on a, and that is, so the one that Chris from Leaf by Leaf talked about is William Gaddis, his book, The Recognitions. He also wrote the book called JR, which I would like to check out too once I can get past reading this book. This might be the same people who wrote, the same publishing company who published Life and Fate, because it looks similar to it, the back description and everything. But anyway, so this is about, and this, I can't even tell you what this is about. I don't even remember. I have to read the back to you guys. So I'm not gonna, because this really is a 7 on Sunday book talking about books that intimidate you, so I'm not gonna tell you what this is about. But this, first of all, look at how long this is. And again, this is another one that feels very stream of conscious with the writing style, and he's also an author that does not believe in using quotations in their dialogue, which is a little confusing because it's what I'm used to, the quotations, and it's kind of annoying when James Joyce is the same way. He doesn't use quotations. Like, I don't understand that. What do you mean you don't believe in quotations? Everybody uses quotations in every book I've read, until your guys' books. Most people use quotations. I don't understand those authors thinking, like, oh, I don't, like, it has been, I think Chris from Leaf by Leaf explained it when he was talking about, authors like, William Gaddis and probably James Joyce, and why their way of thinking, but I don't remember what he said. So at the moment, I just don't get it, why you don't use quotations. I mean, what's wrong with quotations? I mean, how does one look more natural than the other? But, anyway, it's like this guy who wants to be, he's having a bit of a crisis, I think, in, about life. Not I don't know if it would be a spiritual crisis, but some kind of crisis about, like, his own self-worth or something like that. I don't remember. I mean, I feel like I need to start over with this, but every time I start over, then I end up feeling like I still feel confused. It doesn't make that much of a difference, but that's really, again, this is another one that it's really about the writing style that's a bit throws me off, and how everything is in chunks, the way it's written, that's very confusing. And like there are certain times when I would love to read this, but I can't, because, like, I can't read books like that in the car. That kind of print, I can't read in the car when we go visiting, the motion. Not that I get sick. I mean, I don't get car sick. I get, plane sick, as I always say, which I'm gonna have to take some Benadryl with me on that when we go to London. I mean, I kind of would rather not, because, I'm already gonna be tired when we get there. But anyway, getting off topic. So yeah, the writing is very intimidating, and it's very dense, in the literal sense, not just what's in it, but you know, how it's presented to the reader. You know, like I can't be tired. Like I can't have very tired eyes. I have to be very awake and my eyes have to be open and no distractions, which is very hard to find sometimes. But anyway, and it's just one of those books that has a lot of deep, thought-provoking themes and just, you know, it's something I want to try. I don't, you know, it's a lot. See, I'm even having trouble pinpointing why it's so intimidating other than, you know, the length. But anyway, so I'm going to stop there because I'm mumbling now. I'm rambling now. So those are the 7 intimidating books for me. So, what are your intimidating books? What are the 7 books that intimidate you? Or even just what is one book that intimidates you? Share in the comments below. And if you like this video, please click subscribe. Give me a thumbs up. Click the bell notification button if you want to be notified. And I will send the link to Grace's group on Goodreads in case you want to do one of these topics. Or if you like want to join the group. Like I said, these topics are really fun, and I kind of like the whole 7 options over 5. That, you know, top 5 Wednesday. But anyway, so I hope you are enjoying your reading, and I will talk to y'all later. All right, bye.